Some men are not lazy. They are not weak, unmotivated, or incapable. They're rebuilding from things that most people cannot see or do not care to see. Whether it's a relationship that's ended badly, money problems, financial situation up and down, a career that went nowhere, mistakes they're ashamed of, distance from their children, the loss of confidence, identity, and the future that they thought they were building. And I think because they're rebuilding, and rebuilding rarely looks impressive from the outside, they start believing that they are failing. So this is a message to those men because I've been in that situation and I am in that situation myself. You're not finished. You're simply in the part of the story that nobody applauds. Nobody sees the mornings where you wake up carrying the same problems and still get yourself out of bed. Nobody congratulates you for going to work when you feel completely drained. Nobody notices the night you nearly made another bad decision but stopped yourself. Nobody celebrates the ordinary day when you trained, when you worked, when you ate properly, when you went to bed at a good, reasonable hour, when you stayed calm and kept promises to yourself and others, and ultimately went to bed not making your life any worse. But these are the days that matter. In fact, these are the days which often show that your life is actually changing. These are the days and the moments where your life changes the most, because rebuilding doesn't usually begin with one big dramatic moment. It begins when you finally become tired of repeating the same patterns, the same destruction, the same habits which led nowhere. And then you make one slightly better decision, and then another, and another. And they stack and compound. And over time, the compounding effect of these good decisions is what ultimately changes your life. At first, it doesn't feel like progress. It won't feel like progress. It'll feel slow, repetitive, pointless. And you'll think to yourself, what the heck am I doing? Why am I even doing this? You might be earning less money than you once did. You might be living somewhere that you didn't expect to live. You might be starting again at an age when you thought you would already have everything sorted out. You look around and see other people buying houses, going on holidays all the time, getting married, lots of children, building businesses, traveling, and appearing to move forward in life. Meanwhile, you're just trying to make it through the week without falling apart. That comparison can ultimately destroy you, because you're comparing somebody else's visible result against the foundations of your unfinished rebuild. And foundations rarely look impressive. They look like boring routine. They look like repeating the same good decision over and over. They look like turning up for work, training even when your confidence is low, cleaning your house, cleaning your home, cleaning your room, cleaning your kitchen, paying off the debts that you owe, eating a proper meal instead of escaping into another bad habit, eating some beans and toast rather than getting another £5 takeaway, creating something instead of endlessly consuming, going to sleep knowing that the day wasn't exciting, but at least you moved the day in the right direction. And this doesn't appear to be a comeback on the surface, but it is. One of the hardest parts of rebuilding is accepting how ordinary it can feel. We imagine transformation to this huge emotional event. We think, well, we'll wake up one morning and completely be motivated, completely full of confidence, and finally ready to attack life. But most of the time, that feeling never arrives. You rebuild while you're uncertain. You rebuild while you're tired. You rebuild while wondering, is any of this even going to work? You rebuild while you still miss the part of the life that you lost. This is why discipline matters. This is where discipline really shows. And this is where discipline can ultimately take you to a new phase of life. It gives you something which is stable enough to follow, where you can actually begin to start trusting yourself again. Not because discipline turns you into some emotional machine, because it doesn't. Emotionless machine, should I say, because it doesn't. It just gives you that foundation where you can keep on going. There's been periods of my own life where routine was incredibly simple, and most of the time now it still is incredibly simple. Work, train, sleep, eat, create, boring stuff daily. Every single day, I just do the same things. And it's not glamorous. It isn't glamorous. And it's not solving everything overnight. It's not like I do all that. I do all those things in one day and then tomorrow my life's fixed and sorted, because that is not the case. But it gives the day structure, which then gives the week structure, the month structure, the year structure. And if you do this for a year, then your life will begin to change big time. Sometimes your whole life can feel uncertain. Structure is the first thing that makes you feel safe again. You don't need to rebuild everything all at once. I often talk to people who are in sort of a rebuilding phase of their life, and they say they want to do this, that, and the other. And it's just simply not possible. You're not going to transform everything overnight. You just need to get the basics right. Start small, and over time, let the small things compound, and that's when you'll have something big. You need to prove to yourself that you can be trusted with the next decision. And this is where confidence actually comes from. Confidence isn't endlessly telling yourself that you're amazing. That's self-delusion. That's probably narcissism in some way or another. Confidence is remembering that, you said you would do something and then you actually do it. And you watch yourself do it. You observe yourself do it. You said you would train and you go train, even if you feel like a big bag of poo. You said you would save the money, so you saved the money. You said you wouldn't message that person again, and you didn't. You said you would finish the work, and you finished it. Every promise you keep becomes another piece of evidence that you are no longer the man that allowed everything to collapse. You're no longer that same person. And I think something else in that, there is something else I think men need to understand. You do not have to announce your comeback. I would advise you probably don't. You don't need to explain every goal to every person. In fact, I would advise not to. You don't need to convince everybody that you've changed. When you're desperate for people to recognize your progress, you can start performing the rebuild instead of actually living it. You post the plans, you talk about the business, you describe the new routine, you tell all your friends around you that you're going to do X, Y, and Z. You tell everybody who you're becoming, but the words can give you the emotional reward before the actual earned result happens. So build quietly. Let people misunderstand where you are. Let them believe you're moving slowly. Let them wonder why you disappeared for a while. You don't need to look successful during the rebuild, not whatsoever. Who you're trying to impress. It's your life. You need to become stable, because stability is what gives you ultimately something to build on. If everything's rickety-rockety at the bottom, it's all going to come crashing down at some point. You need that stable foundation. You're not starting from zero. Starting again is not the same as starting empty. You're bringing experience with you. You know what bad decisions cost. You know which relationships disturbed your peace. You know what happens when you ignore the warning signs. That's a big one. You know what avoidance, anger, addiction, pride, impulsiveness can take from you. You might have lost years of your life. You might have lost tons and tons of cash. You might have lost people that you genuinely loved. But you have not lost the lessons, unless you choose to ignore them. This is where wisdom comes into the picture. You build wisdom through experience of life. That experience can make the next version of your life stronger than the first. That's the goal. Not because suffering automatically makes someone better, because it certainly does not. Sometimes suffering makes people absolutely bitter. Sometimes suffering causes PTSD, and someone will never be the same. Sometimes it makes people destructive. Sometimes they use what happened in the past as permission to hurt themselves and everybody around them. Pain only becomes useful when you take responsibility for what you do with it. You might not be responsible for everything that happened to you. Granted, I totally understand that. But eventually, you become responsible for what happens next. That can feel unfair. Absolutely, I know, 1,000,000%. But it's also where your power returns. Because if your future is entirely controlled by what somebody else did, they still own part of your life. And I don't think you want that. Taking responsibility doesn't mean accepting blame for everything, because, you can't control everything that goes on in the world. So you can't take the blame for the weather. You can't take the blame for somebody else's actions. People choose what they do, essentially. But it means deciding that you can no longer hand control of tomorrow to what happened yesterday. So maybe you aren't where you expected to be right now. Maybe your life is still very uncertain. Maybe it feels a bit shaky. Maybe you're working a job you don't want to work. Maybe you're living in circumstances you didn't choose to live in. Maybe you're trying to repair damage that took years to create. But the fact that you're still rebuilding means something inside of you refused to stay down. Do not dismiss that. Start smaller than your pride wants. Stay consistent longer than your emotions want. Your emotions will want to give up in 5 minutes. Your amygdala in your brain will try and appease your emotions, your emotional state. You have to bypass this with your prefrontal cortex and use logic and reason as the parameters of your actions and beliefs. Stay consistent longer than your emotions want. Stop mistaking an unfinished life for a failed one. You do not need to fix everything today. You just need to stop abandoning yourself today. Make your next decision properly. Then the next decision after that. And keep going until the quiet work becomes a life that you're actually proud of. You're not finished. This is Jake O'Neill Talks, honest commentary on modern life.